This video is all about inking. I'm going to show you the tools that I use now, show you some of the tools that I used to use, and explain to you why I've made the choices to switch over when I have. And then I'm going to go through a rundown, starting with brushes, going into brush pens, and then into microns and fine liners, and give you the entire rundown of how I ink a page from start to finish. I'm David Finch. I've been a comic book artist for over 25 years. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. And if you have any comments, leave them below. And if you have any tools that you prefer to use, leave those in the comments below as well. Also, be sure to check out my upcoming Red Sonja cover from Dynamite Entertainment. It's on Indiegogo. I think going live, if not now, it'll be within the next couple of days. And I also have a Batman Catwoman cover that is available in the description below. You can find them both down there. All right, we're going to start with the Winsor & Newton Series 7 brush. This is an iconic brush in the business. Scott Williams uses this, Danny Mickey uses this, Richard Friend uses this. All the best inkers in the business at one time or another have used this brush. And this is a brush that I used for quite a while, especially when I started inking again recently. This is an exercise that I learned from inkers way back when I first started in comics. We had a lot of inkers coming in, and they all learned with some of these simple exercises. And so I'm going to start with a very thick line. And okay, somewhat thick, there we go, and try my very best to get a nice clean line and go from one end to the other, stopping, and thin it out just a little bit more each time. And my level of control with these brushes is not really what I would love it to be. You can see my line is not so subtle when I'm doing this. That's about the best that I can do. Just coming in cold with one of these brushes. And this is why I don't use these brushes for most of my detail. And so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to draw some thin to thick rendering lines with the same brush. And so I start with a little bit more pressure and I just ease off and get a nice thick line that comes to a point. And I can also go quite a bit thinner with these too. And this is always my problem with a brush. If you give me hours and hours, I can start to get comfortable, but I rarely have time to just reach a comfort level with these things. It just takes a level of control. It's a very little pressure because it's a very sensitive brush. But it does give you a really pretty line. It's very, very crisp, and you can see why it's been such a classic in the business for so many years. For the next brush, we're going to move on to a Kiritaki No. 50 fountain hairbrush pen. And this is also a sable brush, but it's a fountain pen, and so you actually put ink into a chamber in here. It can be a little finicky. I've got a tool to do it, which I lost, so I just make a mess in the sink when I fill these, but they work very, very well. And they work just about as well as a sable brush. Now, a big issue is that you'll run out of ink a lot faster, and then you have to fill it. Also, I tend to use a very thin ink. I'm using a different ink with this one. Now I'm making my other lines thicker to try and compensate for my original thin line. Here we go. And this is where you really see a non-inker trying to get the level of control that a professional inker with years of experience can get. And I can get something that's pretty similar. It's really not perfect. I don't have to dip this pen, which is a huge bonus. So I'm going to draw out the same kinds of lines that I had just earlier on. My line is kind of splitting a little bit, and that's because I'm not getting enough ink down into the brush, and that can be a real problem with these ones, I find. And you can see I'm also getting a bit of a drag out in the line where it's losing ink. And so I'm not getting the crisp point that I could get with the other brush. And I just find that to be, I can actually get more detail, tighter detail, because I end up with a little less ink on the brush itself. And that can be a bonus, but it makes it really difficult for me to achieve those kinds of lines. And finally, I've got my Pentel Refillable brush pen. This whole end actually screws the opposite way. You can take it off, and you get these things in basically cartridges. They look like this. The ink comes out the end, and they're very convenient. You get a nice dark ink, which I really like. It looks good with my other brush pens, or my other pens in general. The downside is that it is not waterproof. And I also find, because this one has a synthetic tip, I have a little bit more trouble getting control. It really doesn't have the sensitivity of a sable. But in some ways that can be good for me. And you can see I think I'm actually getting a bit of so far, maybe a better result. Maybe I'm telling myself that. And there's a bit of a graduation with this pen, and I can do the same kinds of lines. I'm getting a bit of a drag out effect with this one also. Really, no brush can possibly compare with the original Winsor & Newton sable. But the sable comes at the cost of having to dip into ink all the time and keeping the brush clean and caring for the brush. And there's a little maintenance that I'm not necessarily prepared to do. I really like having a brush that gives me a lot of mobility. This is something I could bring to a convention. It's something that I can sit on the couch at night and watch television and work with. I feel like I'm running out of ink a little bit in this. Also, when they start to run out, you can just squeeze them and a little bit more ink will come into the chamber. You have to be a little careful because it can dump right out. But they're a good, reliable brush. I use these to fill in larger areas, to block in my shadows, and do things that don't require a lot of detail. Once I have my larger black areas filled in and the things that don't require quite as much detail, I switch over to my brush pens. This is a Tombow fudenosuke brush pen with a hard tip. They also have a soft tip. I like the hard tip because I get a little bit more control. I find, especially being a penciler, I have a tendency to press hard. And so I prefer a pen that gives me the ability to press a little bit harder without making a total mess. And so I'm gonna go ahead and just do the same thing that I did with the brush. I'm gonna start thicker, and you can see I can get that same kind of thick line and just get a little thinner as I go. Actually probably getting a little too thin here. Now with these, you can see I went a little too thin. It's much easier for me to go in and finesse the line. I just have so much more control over these than I do with a brush. And this is why I really use these as my brush. I don't want to say replacement because I do use a brush, but I use these as a real supplement to get actual detail. And in a way, these are very, very similar to a quill, which I'm going to show in just a minute. Because these are a plastic tip, they really don't carry the kind of ink that you can get into a brush. And so when I throw my rendering, it tends to not come out to a perfect point and start to fade out. And that's just the nature of the pen. And so what I'll do a lot of times, if I really want it to fill in, I'll just repeat the stroke, and I have more control over this pen. So it kind of gives me the ability to do that. And I can get something much, much cleaner. Even though it doesn't really have the same line beauty that you can get out of a Sabal, it's much easier for me with my level of hand control to get that kind of an effect. And so what I'm doing is I'm going thick to thin, I'm going along my arm. So I'm using my wrist a little bit, but really my whole arm to just throw that line. I also can throw this way, but less effectively. And I'm going with my wrist to do this. I can pull my lines, and a lot of inkers are more comfortable pulling lines than pushing lines, and I'd suggest you give it a try both ways just to see where your comfort level is. And I'll show these in more detail in just a minute, but I use these for my detail. But these pens, especially when they're new and they're not too worn in, I can get an incredibly thin line with them and a lot of detail. And I can get most of my picture drawn in with one of these pens. Before I started using brush pens and my synthetic brushes and microns, I was actually using a quill and a traditional brush. And when you use a quill, you have a body that you buy separately from a nib. This nib is a G pen, and I can just slide it in here. It goes into the larger section, if I can get it in there. And you dip your ink into the end, and you can see how it spreads apart and it pushes ink down onto the page, depending on the pressure that you use. You need to be very careful to not fill your quill past that hole that you see in the center, and I always do that, which is part of the reason I stopped using these. Another thing to be aware of, with a quill, you can only go in one direction. If you try and double back, you'll actually, and it worked, of course, now that I say that, but generally speaking, you have to be very aware that it can catch the page and spray ink everywhere. So you want to be aware of that and only go away from, you want to go toward the concave part of your quill. And I find with this, I can get a line, whoops, too far. I can get a line that I'm pretty happy with this. I'm having trouble getting too thin. The kind of subtlety that I can get with this and the kind of cleanliness already is a little bit more difficult with these. They do give me a really crisp thin to thick or thick to thin line. This is another reason why I stopped using these. Every like 4 or 5 strokes, I'm having to refill this thing. And look at how thick that line just got. There's just so much unpredictability. I also have, and this is much more equivalent to what inkers used when I first started. This is essentially a Japanese equivalent to a 102. And it's much easier to get a cleaner line with this. It has more control than the G Pen, but it doesn't put out as much ink. I spent a little bit of time using the G Pen, and I finally stopped because I just could not get the control. I actually ultimately had a little bit more control with a brush, which is truly crazy. But these ones give me everything that I can get from a Tombow, and they have the added bonus of not giving me the kind of blown out line that I get with the Tombow. So they are a superior tool, there's no doubt about it. The downside is, if you're drawing with your ink, and you can see how this is scratching into the paper, and I'm gonna pull out my Tombow, I can push a line out this way, I can bring it back, I can zigzag, I can go all over the page, draw circles, they look terrible, but I can do it and really get whatever kind of an effect I want to get. Whereas when I'm using a quill, I'm going this way, I can't go back this way, it just won't work properly. I can't really effectively do circles the same way. I have to be really careful to not drag against the pen. They just give me a lot less mobility when I'm working, and because I tend to draw with ink, it makes it very, very difficult to use, and that is why I stopped. All right, the last type of tool that I use is a Micron. This is a Pigma Micron. You can see it says 01, and this is a Molotow black liner, also what this one says 0.1, but they're the same size. And so the great thing about these is they give me an even line every single time. No matter how much pressure I put on it, I get the same line. If I want to build it up, I can do it just like I would do it with a pencil. I can just scumble and then come out of it. And so in effect, I could actually ink an entire picture with one of these, and I have done it. But I can get an incredible amount of very, very fine detail with these. And it also gives me a lot of control where I don't have any lines blowing out or getting too thick. I also really like to line out my pictures with these. So my process generally will be to draw, and I'll usually have a little bit of pencil here to work from, but I'll draw an arm. This will be my arm detail, and I'll do it with one of these pens just like this. Then I come in with my brush and I throw in my dark shapes. I love these versus using a pencil and having to scumble in my shapes. I can just throw it in there very quickly with a brush. It takes a little bit of confidence because it's more difficult to erase. Obviously you can't erase ink, you can use whiteout, but you want to be a little bit more careful. So if I'm not sure of where I want to go with something, I always do just a little bit more pencil work. And so you can see my brush inking is actually very, very loose and sketchy. And I might be a little cleaner with it, but really not much, because my next step is to go ahead and go in with my Molotow and just clean up all my lines, make everything make sense, and I can really get something nice and crisp much quicker than if I try and fight with a brush. So that's my second stage. And I can also, depending on the size of the picture, I can also get in quite a bit of line work with this pen as well. I'll just do that right now. And then once I've got some of that in, I like to use my Micron pen, and that's where I can really go in and completely clean things up. But I can get all my tight little detail in. I use scumbling where I need to get a bit of a thin to thick, but I just get so much subtlety with these pens. And I can get a really clean effect using a brush pen, and then one of these, and then just a little bit of whiteout, which I'll show you in just a minute. Just clean up any places that get a little bit ugly or get a little hairy or where I have trouble. The next step in my process, this is a Posca, a Uni Posca whiteout pen. They have great coverage. If it doesn't cover well in the first pass, the great thing about these is because they're a brush pen, you can see I'm getting a little dark there. It's all right though, because I'll be able to put on another layer and then just clean that up a little bit more. And I can take a really, really messy picture and clean it up quite a bit. And I can also go back in with my inking pens and rework this. And that's something that you really can't do with more traditional whiteout, the kind of whiteout that I've always used in the past. It really fights with any kind of a pressure pen. You can use a brush on it and it tends to work because a brush puts on so little pressure, but with pens it makes it incredibly difficult. And so I get something that's quite a bit cleaner very, very easily with my white. And especially if I had the patience to let this dry just a little bit more, it dries very quickly too. I can really sculpt my lines and create a finished effect that really, really works. And it saves me quite a bit of effort. It's almost like having an eraser, but kind of even better. And it's these pens actually more than anything that led me to start really just drawing with ink. So the last thing that I want to show you is how to use a ruler with all of your different tools. Now, what I have here, and you can see I've been using this ruler for quite a while, it has a beveled edge, and so on this side, the edge bevels down. If you turn it over, it rides up, and I use these upside down because I like to have my edge raised from the page, especially if you're using a quill or traditional kind of a tool, because they will bleed under the edge and make an absolute mess. So I'm going to start with my brush, and the way you use a brush is you tilt the pen up with your hand rest the brush along the ruler, and then you just run that line. And that's it. And it looks fairly easy, but to get that line placed exactly where you want it, get the ruler lined up exactly how you want it, get the exact thickness, it is very, very difficult. I did this for a little while because I thought this is the way you have to do it, and I realized that this is truly torture. It is incredibly difficult to get anything really clean that way. And so now using a quill, I can rest the ruler down on the page, and as long as I have that edge lifted, I can just rest it along the ruler and I can pretty easily get some lines out of it. It works actually very, very well. I do find though that quills tend to build up on the ruler. You can see I've got a little bit built up there. That can be a problem. They also take a long time to dry. And as a result, it's really, really easy to run your ruler up into it and end up with that happening. And I've done that a million times. I finally stopped using these for that reason. And so the way that I use rulers, and that really, really works for me, is I just limit them to my brush pens and to my microns. It solves me a million problems. They don't build up on the page. I can basically move the ruler on it right after I'm finished. It's really easy. I can use these almost like a pencil. I can even actually turn the ruler so I have the flat side down, and it still really won't give me any problems at all. And I can just run that ruler. These give me a nice thin to thick. I can go thicker. I can go quite a bit thinner and get a real range. And that's it. And with microns, for this one I'm going to use my Pigma, and I can do the same thing. I don't need to worry about the edge at all. It works just like using a pencil. These ones are really by far the easiest to use with a ruler. And these are great for speed lines. I can zip out a speed line. I can actually do that with the tombow also. And I use these for my backgrounds. Basically, my combination is these to block in my buildings and make sure that everything lines up and everything is working pretty well. I've got, here's my side of a building here, get a floor here, and then I can use my thicker pens, get in there and start to get some line weight in. And these also have the benefit of giving me a line with some character to it. And for the side of the building, I could go ahead and just make it dark. That's all my tools for building. And so here's an overview of all the tools that I use, from brushes down to Micron and whiteout, including some tools that I phased out over time and then replaced with something that I think is a little bit more versatile and much more forgiving. All right, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out our Monday Night Draw live stream, 8 o'clock Eastern every week, and I will see you in the next video.